Fall 1975, Tinsley Elementary, Richmond, Virginia. The brick building stood quietly on a narrow street lined with hickory trees. It was old, with white paint peeling off its shutters, but Tinsley Elementary was known for its vibrance, a place where the laughter of children often echoed across the schoolyard. This morning, however, the usual buzz of excitement felt muted, the air heavier than usual. Inside, Mrs. Elaine Greer, one of the last black teachers to remain after integration, looked out of the classroom window. She was a woman of profound dignity, short in stature with silver-streaked hair pinned into a neat bun, but her voice carried the power of authority and warmth. For the past 25 years, she had nurtured students at Tinsley as if they were her own. She taught them not just to read and write, but to see themselves clearly in a world determined to obscure their worth. But today, she was uncertain about the future of the school, her students, and even her place within these newly integrated walls. Integration had brought more white students to Tinsley, but it had also brought changes she never imagined. Resources were pouring into the school for the first time in years, new textbooks, improved facilities, but Mrs. Greer had begun to realize that resources alone were not the solution to deeper issues. The black teachers were increasingly outnumbered by new white educators, who often lacked the cultural understanding or personal stakes that had guided her and her colleagues. Spring 1955, Washington, D.C. The story had not begun at Tinsley, of course. The seeds of this struggle were sown 2 decades earlier, when the Supreme Court had ruled that separate but equal schools were unconstitutional. Hope had swelled in communities like the one in Richmond, where parents and educators believed the decision meant an end to the systemic neglect and underfunding of black schools. Mrs. Greer, who had just completed her teacher training in the spring of 1955, had attended jubilant rallies and meetings where the older teachers, who had fought for that moment, recounted stories of resilience. Back then, she was full of hope, as were so many others. They imagined a future where black children would have the same opportunities as white children, learning in classrooms filled with the best materials, supported by experienced teachers, all within communities that embraced them. But over the years, the reality unfolded differently. The legal victory of Brown v.'s Board of Education had paved the way for integration, but the implementation was often fraught with hostility and resistance. Across the South, many black schools were shuttered rather than integrated. Teachers like Mrs. Greer, who had been pillars of their communities, found themselves either dismissed or relegated to roles that undervalued their experience. Worse, some schools that had been cultural centers for black communities were demolished, erasing not only educational spaces, but also hubs of identity and pride. Late fall 1975, Tinsley Elementary, Richmond, Virginia. In the classroom, as Mrs. Greer prepared for her morning lessons, she couldn't help but notice the shifting dynamics among her students. Jerome, a bright boy with a shy smile, had started to retreat into himself. He had been one of her most vocal students, proud of his reading ability and eager to share his thoughts. But lately, Jerome seemed wary, hesitant to raise his hand and quick to retreat under the gaze of his new white classmates. Mrs. Greer knew what this was. She had seen it before. Integration, in its ideal form, was meant to bring equality, but in practice, it often meant asking black children to carry the burden of proving their worth in spaces that were not designed for them. It meant that black children like Jerome had to adjust to being seen as outsiders in their own neighborhoods. Outside of school, Jerome's mother, Ruby, had her own concerns. Integration had promised better educational outcomes, but Ruby wasn't sure if the price was too high. She had grown up attending George Washington Carver School, a proud black institution that had not only educated its students academically, but also socially, preparing them to confront the challenges of a segregated world with a sense of shared community. But Carver had closed its doors in 1969, its students dispersed to other schools, and many of its teachers left unemployed or sent to different schools without the same sense of mission. Ruby remembered how Carver's teachers knew her family, her story, and the struggles that defined their lives. At Tinsley, though, Jerome's new teachers had different expectations and little understanding of his background. They saw him as a statistic, a data point in a desegregation plan that, on paper, looked like progress. Ruby wondered if the integration had come at the expense of her son's spirit. A fragmented promise. The chapter concludes with Mrs. Greer's reflective thoughts. The integration movement was never just about the proximity of black and white children. It was about opportunity, resources, and respect. As she looked around her classroom that morning, she felt the weight of a promise that had been both broken and fulfilled in uneven, complicated ways. Integration had transformed schools, but it had also forced Black children and educators to adapt to a system that was not truly built for them. The students now learned under the same roof, but the walls still held biases and barriers that integration alone could not dismantle. Mrs. Greer closed her lesson book and began her class with a question. What does fairness look like to you? It was a simple question, but she knew that the answers, like integration itself, would be complex and revealing. Winter 1976, Tinsley Elementary, Richmond, Virginia. Mrs. Elaine Greer stood at the front of the class, flipping through the new math textbooks that had arrived that morning. The pristine covers and glossy pages were a welcome change from the torn, faded books she'd used for years. For a moment, it seemed like progress, proof that the promises of integration might finally be taking shape. But as she looked over the curriculum, her optimism waned. It wasn't just that the material was new, it was different, almost foreign. The examples and scenarios it presented were disconnected from the lives of her students, particularly the Black children, who often struggled to relate to stories of ski trips and yacht races. As Mrs. Greer prepared for the lesson, she felt a gnawing sense of urgency. Education, she believed, was meant to reflect the students it served, to validate their experiences, not to ignore them. Yet, in this integrated school, she was forced to adapt to a curriculum designed by people who had likely never set foot in a neighborhood like the one that surrounded Tinsley. Richmond, 1968, the boardroom battle. While teachers like Mrs. Greer adjusted to daily classroom changes, the real battles were being waged elsewhere, in the boardrooms, courtrooms, and city council chambers, where integration policies were debated, shaped, and enforced. In 1968, the Richmond School Board held a pivotal meeting that would set the tone for integration in the city. The meeting was packed with parents, activists, and educators, all clamoring to have their voices heard. At the center of the controversy was a plan to bus Black students to predominantly white schools across the city, with the promise of improved educational resources. Ruby was there that evening, sitting toward the back of the room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She was there not just as a concerned mother, but as a representative of a larger community. A community whose schools were rapidly closing, whose teachers were being laid off, and whose children were being sent far from home to unfamiliar schools. We need to make sure integration doesn't just mean relocation, a Black parent stood up and argued. Our children need support, not just a seat in a different classroom. The applause that followed was fierce, but it did little to sway the board's decision. The plan was approved, and the buses rolled out within months. By the time Jerome entered Tinsley Elementary, the integration process was well underway, but its effects were already becoming visible. Spring 1976, Tinsley Elementary, Jerome's new world. In Mrs. Greer's classroom, Jerome found himself increasingly caught between two worlds. At home, he was Jerome Thomas Jr., the youngest of four, whose evenings were filled with church gatherings, porch conversations, and neighborhood basketball games. But at school, he was simply Jerome T., the boy who struggled to make sense of new concepts in books that seemed written for someone else. One afternoon, during lunch, Jerome sat alone on the edge of the playground. He watched the other children form small groups, some with friends they had known for years, others tentatively bridging the gap between races. The schoolyard, like the city itself, was a microcosm of forced proximity, where integration was more an experiment in tolerance than an embrace of difference. "Hey, Jerome," called out a white boy named Danny, who had recently transferred to Tinsley. Danny was one of the few white students who seemed to genuinely try to befriend the Black kids, though his attempts were often clumsy and unsure. Jerome nodded, not wanting to seem rude, but he remained seated. "Why don't you come play?" Danny asked, his voice a mix of innocence and awkwardness. "It's just a game." Jerome hesitated, knowing that just a game had never been that simple. He had heard stories from older kids about fights that had broken out during games, as about words exchanged that didn't mean much to white kids, but cut deeply for Black ones. He had felt, too, the subtle differences in how teachers treated him and his Black classmates compared to white students like Danny, who always seemed to get the benefit of the doubt. The hidden costs of progress. Meanwhile, Mrs. Greer and the remaining Black staff at Tinsley grappled with a different kind of struggle. The shifting expectations of what it meant to be a Black teacher in an integrated school. For decades, Black educators had been both academic instructors and cultural mentors, guiding students not just through textbooks, but through the social realities of being Black in America. Now, in this new era, their roles were being confined to standardized curriculums, their authority diluted by bureaucratic oversight that rarely considered their input. Miss Helen Jacobs, one of the newer white teachers, often found herself working alongside Mrs. Greer. Helen, fresh out of college, had come to Tinsley with good intentions but lacked the deeper understanding that experience brought. She was earnest but often overwhelmed by the cultural dynamics at play. "It's just teaching," Helen once said to Mrs. Greer during a staff meeting. "I mean, kids are kids, right?" Mrs. Greer paused, weighing her response carefully. "Yes, they are," she replied. "But their experiences, their histories, those aren't the same. If we ignore that, we're not really teaching, we're just talking at them." It was a conversation that Helen would later reflect upon, one that made her realize how much she still had to learn, not just about her students, but about the very meaning of education itself. Summer 1976. The roots of resistance. Outside the classroom, the struggle for meaningful integration continued in the community. Ruby, increasingly frustrated by the limitations of the school system, joined a local advocacy group. The group was made up of parents, former teachers, and local activists, all dedicated to making integration work, not just in name, but in practice. "We need to demand more," Ruby argued during one of the meetings. "We can't just accept a seat in a classroom. We need a voice in how our children are taught, in what they learn." The group's demands ranged from hiring more Black teachers to revising curriculums that reflected Black history and culture. But progress was slow, and Ruby often felt like she was pushing against an invisible wall, one that was built not from blatant racism, but from indifference and complacency. The long road ahead. As the school year drew to a close, Mrs. Greer's thoughts lingered on the future. Integration had brought undeniable changes, some good, some merely symbolic. Jerome's grades had slipped, not from lack of ability, but from a lack of connection. Ruby continued to fight, knowing that her son's education was both a personal and communal struggle. Mrs. Greer looked out the window once more, watching as students scattered across the playground. Integration had promised a new beginning, but she knew that real change would require more than shared spaces. It would require shared commitment, an acknowledgement of past harms, and a dedication to a truly equitable future. As she gathered her things, Mrs. Greer couldn't help but feel that integration in its current form was an unfinished story. It was a step toward equality, but the journey was far from over. Fall 1976, Tinsley Elementary, Richmond, Virginia. The leaves were just beginning to turn, painting the landscape around Tinsley Elementary in shades of red and gold. As the morning bell rang, Jerome walked slowly to his classroom, head down, his mind weighed by more than just the schoolwork ahead. In the months since integration began, he had grown more silent, his once vibrant curiosity replaced by a quiet wariness. He wasn't the only one. His Black classmates, too, seemed to carry a new kind of fatigue, one born not of physical exhaustion, but of emotional strain. Mrs. Greer had noticed it immediately. It was the same pattern she had seen over the years. Students, particularly Black boys, withdrawing in response to the unspoken expectations that came with integration. They were expected to be compliant, to adapt seamlessly to environments that were, at best, indifferent and at worst, hostile to their presence. Jerome sat at his desk, flipping through the pages of a social studies book. Today's lesson was about American presidents, a topic that always felt distant to him. He struggled to see himself in the stories of white men in powdered wigs or polished suits. When Mrs. Greer began to speak, though, he listened closely. She had a way of making history relevant, of connecting it to the everyday realities of their lives. "Remember," she said, "history isn't just about names and dates. It's about understanding why things happened and how they affect us today." She looked out at the sea of young faces, determined to reach them. "So when you read about these presidents, ask yourself, what would they have done if they knew you? How might you have changed their decisions?" The church basement meetings. While students like Jerome wrestled with lessons in the classroom, their parents fought battles outside of it. Ruby had become a regular at the weekly meetings held in the basement of Mount Zion Baptist Church. The gatherings, often filled with a mix of frustration and determination, were a place where parents could speak openly about the realities of integration and strategize for change. "We need more than just representation," Ruby said at one of the meetings. "We need real inclusion. Our children can't keep carrying this burden alone." The room nodded in agreement, the weight of collective concern palpable. The discussion turned to hiring more Black teachers, increasing funding for culturally relevant programs, and ensuring that school policies reflected the needs of Black students. But despite their best efforts, Ruby and her fellow advocates often found themselves stonewalled by bureaucracy, delays, excuses, and promises that were rarely kept. Reverend Daniels, a charismatic leader in the community and a longtime ally in the struggle for civil rights, leaned forward. "We can't let them think we'll settle for less. The moment we do, they'll stop listening altogether." But Ruby's frustration wasn't just with the system, it was also with the pace of change. For every small victory they achieved, there seemed to be new obstacles. Integration had brought children together in classrooms, but it hadn't dismantled the deeply rooted structures of racism that shaped those spaces. The strain on teachers. As integration continued to reshape Tinsley Elementary, Mrs. Greer found herself torn between two roles: teacher and advocate. It wasn't enough to teach math or reading. She had to be an interpreter of culture, a guide through the complexities of identity, and more often than she liked, a buffer against racism. One afternoon, Helen Jacobs, the young white teacher from Chapter 2, approached Mrs. Greer in the teacher's lounge. Helen's face was a mix of fatigue and confusion. "Elaine," she began hesitantly, "I'm struggling. I want to connect with my students, but I feel like I'm constantly saying the wrong things." Mrs. Greer paused, considering how much she could say and how much Helen was ready to hear. "It's not just about saying the right things, Helen. It's about understanding where these children are coming from. Their histories, their experiences, their frustrations." Helen nodded slowly. "I know, but I don't have that kind of experience. I grew up in a different world." "That's true," Mrs. Greer acknowledged. "But that's why you have to listen more. Not just to the words, but to what's behind them. It's hard work, and it's ongoing." Their conversation ended on a note of quiet reflection, a reminder that integration demanded growth, not just from students, but from educators as well. Winter 1976, Richmond, the turning point. As winter set in, tensions in Richmond were growing. The local newspaper ran an editorial lauding the success of integration, citing improved facilities and diverse classrooms. But the narrative didn't align with the lived experiences of many black families. Ruby read the article and felt a surge of anger. It spoke of integration as a triumph, yet failed to address the persistent inequities within the schools. Ruby, undeterred, decided to organize a community forum, inviting school board members, parents, and local activists. She knew that real change required public pressure, and she was determined to make their voices heard. The forum was held at the community center, drawing a large crowd of parents, educators, and even a few curious students. "We've been patient," Ruby began, standing at the front of the room, her voice strong and steady. "But patience won't fix broken systems. We need action. Our children deserve better." Jerome watched his mother from the back of the room, a mix of pride and anxiety on his face. He admired Ruby's courage, but he also understood the risks. She had faced threats before, from angry parents who saw integration as an unwelcome intrusion, and from officials who preferred quiet compliance over outspoken resistance. The ripple effects. The aftermath of the forum was felt across the school district. Local news picked up the story, framing it as a debate over whether integration was truly serving the needs of all students. The coverage brought new attention to the struggles of black students like Jerome and added pressure on the school board to address ongoing disparities. Back at Tinsley, Mrs. Greer felt a shift in the atmosphere. The conversations among teachers had grown more candid, with some white teachers expressing a willingness to confront the biases in their classrooms. Helen, in particular, had started to incorporate lessons that focused more on black history and culture, often consulting Mrs. Greer for guidance. Yet, the underlying tension remained. Integration had opened doors, but it hadn't erased the barriers that lingered just inside. For every step forward, there seemed to be 2 steps back, a reminder that the path to equality was neither straight nor smooth. Jerome's small victory. Amid the ongoing challenges, Jerome found a small source of pride. In the spring, the school held a Black History Month assembly, organized largely by Mrs. Greer and a few other black teachers. Jerome was chosen to recite a poem by Langston Hughes, a moment that both excited and terrified him. Ruby coached him at home, her voice steady as she encouraged him to speak clearly and with confidence. On the day of the assembly, Jerome stood on the stage, heart racing but determined. As he spoke the lines, "I too am America," he felt a surge of belonging he hadn't experienced in months. The applause that followed was loud and genuine, a small but significant victory in a school that still struggled to understand the full meaning of inclusion. Moving forward. As Chapter 3 comes to a close, the characters are left at a crossroads. Ruby continues her fight, now with greater urgency and community support. Mrs. Greer remains a steadfast presence, pushing for deeper understanding among her colleagues and more meaningful engagement with her students. And Jerome, despite the daily challenges, begins to find his voice, not just as a student, but as a young black boy learning to navigate a world that is still learning to accept him. Integration, they realize, is not the end of the story, it's just the beginning. The journey toward true equality will require more than proximity. It will require empathy, persistence, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Spring 1977, Tinsley Elementary, Richmond, Virginia. The morning was unseasonably warm, and the air inside Mrs. Greer's classroom felt heavy. The students, restless and distracted, seemed eager for the approaching summer break. Jerome sat near the window, absently watching a stray cat wander across the schoolyard. He should have been focused on the math problems in front of him, but his mind was elsewhere, pulled by the complexities of his world that didn't always align with school lessons. Mrs. Greer noticed his detachment. Jerome had improved somewhat since the Black History Month assembly, showing occasional sparks of engagement, but the daily grind of school remained challenging. She approached his desk quietly, hoping to reach him without drawing unwanted attention. "Jerome," she said softly, "I know this isn't the most exciting part of the day, but you're making progress. Don't give up now." He looked up at her, offering a small nod. Her words were genuine, and in a world where sincerity often felt rare, he took comfort in that. Yet he wondered why even encouragement sometimes felt like a burden, another thing to carry on top of everything else. The fight for representation. Meanwhile, Ruby had grown more active than ever in her advocacy efforts. After the forum she organized, she found herself at the forefront of the community's push for more Black teachers and culturally relevant curriculums. She'd even been invited to join a special task force focused on equity in education. But Ruby approached her new role with both optimism and wariness. During one of the task force meetings, the conversation turned to hiring practices. A whiteboard member, Mr. Ferguson, tried to reassure the group. "We're working on it," he said. "But these things take time. It's not easy to find qualified Black teachers." Ruby couldn't stay silent. "Mr. Ferguson, we have many qualified Black educators who are ready and willing. It's not about availability, it's about commitment to change." Her words hung in the air, challenging the room to confront a truth often avoided. Integration alone was not enough. It required real investment in the people and communities it claimed to serve. Outside the meetings, Ruby found support among a diverse group of allies. Black parents, sympathetic white parents, and even a few teachers like Helen Jacobs. Helen had become increasingly vocal, advocating for culturally responsive teaching in staff meetings, often using Ruby's arguments to back up her points. One evening, Helen and Ruby met at a local diner, a place that had recently become known for its informal community discussions. As they sipped coffee, Helen admitted, "I didn't realize how much I didn't know, Ruby. I came into teaching thinking I could just focus on the academics." Ruby smiled warmly. "It's not your fault. The system teaches us all to separate things that shouldn't be separated: education and culture, history and reality." The two women sat in a rare moment of solidarity, realizing that their fight wasn't just about changing policies, but about transforming mindsets. The hidden curriculum. Back at Tinsley, Mrs. Greer continued to grapple with what educators often called the hidden curriculum, the unspoken lessons embedded in school culture. It wasn't just what was taught, but how it was taught, and to whom. She noticed that white students were encouraged to be leaders, often chosen to lead class discussions or represent the school in events, while Black students were expected to comply quietly, rarely given the same opportunities to shine. Mrs. Greer tried to counter this bias in small but meaningful ways. She started a classroom project on local history, inviting students to research their own neighborhoods and share stories of their families' contributions to Richmond's past. She hoped the project would help students like Jerome see themselves as central figures in history, not mere footnotes. Jerome, to her surprise, became enthusiastic about the project. He chose to research his grandfather, a local civil rights activist who had organized sit-ins during the 1960s. It was the first time Jerome felt truly connected to an assignment, and he threw himself into it with a passion that Mrs. Greer hadn't seen in him for months. On presentation day, Jerome stood in front of the class, his voice clear and steady. "My grandfather wasn't just fighting for himself," he said. "He was fighting for all of us, so that we could have a better chance." The room was silent, not out of boredom, but out of a newfound respect for the quiet boy who had found his voice through his heritage. Mrs. Greer watched with pride, knowing that this was a small victory against a much larger system. Confrontations and consequences. But not all responses to these changes were positive. One afternoon, Jerome found himself confronted by two white classmates in the hallway. They mocked his presentation, calling it just another story about people complaining. Jerome, usually slow to anger, felt a surge of frustration. He had tried so hard to follow the rules, to be the good student, but it seemed that no amount of compliance could protect him from racism's bite. He clenched his fists, his body tense with a mix of anger and fear. But before he could respond, Mrs. Greer appeared, her voice calm but firm. "What's going on here?" The boys mumbled excuses and quickly walked away, leaving Jerome alone with Mrs. Greer. He looked at her, unsure whether to feel relief or shame. "It's not fair," Jerome said quietly, his eyes downcast. "No, it's not," Mrs. Greer agreed. "But don't let them take your pride, Jerome. Your story matters." It was a lesson that integration alone could not teach, how to stand tall in the face of ignorance. A community at a crossroad. As spring turned into summer, Ruby and her allies planned another community action, a march to demand the immediate hiring of more black educators and the incorporation of black history into the school curriculum year-round, not just during February. Ruby's organizing was beginning to take a toll, both physically and emotionally. Jerome sensed his mother's exhaustion, though she tried to hide it. One night, after a particularly heated meeting, Ruby returned home and found Jerome waiting up for her. "You don't have to do this alone, you know," he said. Ruby's eyes softened. "I'm not alone, baby. I've got you, and I've got the whole community. We're in this together." It was a moment of understanding, one that underscored the deep bond between mother and son. Jerome realized that his mother's fight wasn't just for him. It was for all the children whose futures depended on real change. Helen's awakening. In the midst of the growing activism, Helen Jacobs faced her own turning point. She had joined a training workshop designed to help white educators confront their biases and understand systemic racism. It was an uncomfortable process, one that forced Helen to reconsider her role not just as a teacher, but as part of a broader system that had historically failed black children. She returned to Tinsley with a renewed sense of purpose. During a staff meeting, she spoke openly about the need for more support for black students and the importance of hiring more black teachers. Her words were met with a mix of support and resistance, but Helen was undeterred. She had begun to see that change required more than good intentions. It required action, even when it was uncomfortable. Mrs. Greer, watching from across the room, felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps, she thought, real integration was not impossible, just painfully slow. The road ahead. As the school year came to a close, Tinsley Elementary stood at a crossroads. Integration had brought students together, but it had also exposed the deep, unresolved divisions within the system. Mrs. Greer, Ruby, Jerome, and Helen each carried their own lessons from the year. Lessons that extended beyond textbooks and into the very fabric of their lives. For Jerome, the journey was just beginning. He understood now that his voice mattered, even when others tried to silence it. For Ruby, the fight for equity remained urgent, fueled by the love she had for her son and her community. Mrs. Greer continued to teach not just subjects but resilience, knowing that each day was another step toward a future she might never fully see but still believed in. And for Helen, the year had been a rude awakening, a reminder that the work of integration was not merely about sharing space, but about sharing power. The chapter ends with a sense of cautious hope. Integration, they all knew, was a complicated process, a road paved with both progress and setbacks. But for now, they were still walking it, together, refusing to give up on the promise of a better future. Summer 1977, Richmond, Virginia. The air was thick and sticky with humidity, the kind of heat that made it hard to think straight, let alone plan a protest. Ruby was used to this feeling by now, both the heat and the exhaustion that came from fighting the same battles over and over. But as the summer dragged on, the stakes felt higher. Richmond's school board had made little progress in hiring more black educators, despite repeated promises. Ruby knew the time for polite meetings had passed. What they needed now was pressure. On a hot July afternoon, she met with a group of local parents and activists at her small kitchen table. They gathered around with maps of the city, lists of demands, and an unwavering determination to make their voices heard. "We need to march," Ruby said firmly, her voice cutting through the chatter. "We've tried everything else, and they keep stalling. They'll keep ignoring us unless we make them listen." The group agreed. Plans were set for a march on the school board offices, demanding not only more black teachers, but also the allocation of resources to black schools that had been neglected in the rush to integrate. Ruby was both nervous and resolute. She knew the risks of public confrontation, but she also knew that change wouldn't come without sacrifice. Jerome's Summer of Transformation. For Jerome, the summer brought a different kind of transformation. After the success of his history project, he felt more confident and curious. Mrs. Greer had invited him to participate in a summer program at the local community center focused on Black history and cultural pride. Jerome was hesitant at first, but Ruby encouraged him. "You need to know where you come from to know where you're going," she told him one morning as they sat on the porch, sipping sweet tea. At the program, Jerome met other Black children from across Richmond, many of whom shared his experiences with integration. Some good, but many more difficult. He found a sense of solidarity among them, a feeling that had been hard to find at Tinsley. The program's director, Mr. Harris, was a former civil rights activist who taught not only history, but also practical skills for resistance, how to organize, how to speak publicly, and how to confront authority when necessary. One afternoon, Mr. Harris gathered the group in a circle and asked, "What does power mean to you?" Jerome thought about it for a moment. "It's when you get to decide things," he said finally. "Like what happens to you, not just what happens around you." Mr. Harris nodded. "Exactly. And remember, power isn't just given, it's taken, it's built, and it's defended." Jerome felt a spark within him, a new understanding of the forces that shaped his world and his role in changing it. Mrs. Greer's dilemma. Meanwhile, Mrs. Greer faced a dilemma of her own. The start of the new school year was approaching, and she had been offered a position as a vice principal at a newly integrated high school across town. It was a significant opportunity, one that would mean a better salary and a broader influence over the curriculum and culture of the school. But it would also mean leaving Tinsley Elementary, leaving behind the students who had been central to her life's work. She sought advice from her friend and colleague, Mr. Johnson, one of the few remaining Black male teachers at Tinsley. They met at a small diner one evening, talking quietly over coffee. "You've done so much here, Elaine," Mr. Johnson said, his voice sincere, "but maybe it's time to reach more students, to make a bigger impact." Mrs. Greer nodded slowly, feeling torn. "I know, but I can't shake the feeling that I'd be abandoning the kids here. Especially Jerome, he's just starting to come into his own." Mr. Johnson leaned back, considering her words. "You're not abandoning them. You're preparing the way for others, just like you always have." The decision weighed heavily on Mrs. Greer's mind as she prepared for the start of the new school year. She knew that no matter where she went, the struggle for equity would follow her. The march and its consequences. The day of the march arrived, bringing with it a mix of excitement and tension. Hundreds of people showed up, including Ruby, Jerome, Helen Jacobs, and even Mrs. Greer, who had decided to lend her support despite her internal conflict about leaving Tinsley. Signs reading "More Black Teachers Now" and "Equity in Education" filled the air, along with the rhythmic chants of determined voices. As they marched toward the school board offices, Jerome felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. He was used to hearing about protests from his mother's stories, but this was the first time he was part of one. Ruby held his hand tightly, a silent reminder of the importance of their presence. When they reached the building, the group paused, and Ruby stepped forward to speak. Her voice was clear, filled with both the exhaustion of the past and the hope for the future. "We are not asking for favors," she declared, her words echoing through the crowd. "We are demanding what our children deserve: equality, opportunity, and respect." The speech was met with applause, but not everyone was happy. As the crowd dispersed, a small group of counter-protesters gathered nearby, their faces hard with anger. One man shouted at Ruby, "Go back to where you came from." Ruby's face remained stoic, but Jerome's blood boiled. He stepped forward, ready to defend his mother, but she pulled him back gently. "Not now, baby," she whispered. "Our fight is bigger than this." It was a lesson Jerome would carry with him, a reminder that the fight for justice often required restraint as much as courage. A new beginning at Tinsley. The summer ended, and the new school year began with a mix of anticipation and uncertainty. Mrs. Greer had made her decision. She would stay at Tinsley, at least for one more year. The thought of leaving her students behind had proven too difficult, and she felt a renewed sense of purpose after the march. But change was still coming to Tinsley, both from within and outside its walls. The school board, facing mounting pressure, finally agreed to hire more Black educators and review the curriculum to include more Black history. It was a small victory, but a meaningful one. Helen Jacobs, inspired by the march and her growing bond with Ruby and Mrs. Greer, proposed starting a cultural awareness club at Tinsley. It would be open to all students, focusing on discussions about race, history, and equity. When she pitched the idea to Mrs. Greer, she was met with a broad smile. "It's a start," Mrs. Greer said, her voice filled with a quiet hope. "But let's make sure it's not just about awareness. It has to be about action." The unfolding future. As the year progressed, Jerome's confidence continued to grow. He became a regular at the Cultural Awareness Club, often leading discussions and sharing stories of his grandfather's activism. He found himself mentoring younger students, using the lessons he'd learned from his mother, Mrs. Greer, and the community at large. One afternoon, during a club meeting, Jerome stood up and posed a question to the group. "What would it take for us to really change things here?" he asked. "Not just make it better for a few of us, but for everyone." It was a question that resonated deeply, not just with the students, but with the teachers who listened quietly from the back of the room. Mrs. Greer felt a swell of pride. Jerome was not just adapting, he was leading. Ruby, too, felt a shift. The march had not solved everything, but it had strengthened the community's resolve. The fight for justice in education was far from over, but it was now being driven by a new generation, one that was bolder, more informed, and more willing to demand its place in the world. The chapter closes with a sense of cautious optimism. The journey toward true integration was still long, and the road ahead was filled with both obstacles and opportunities. But for now, the characters were moving forward, each in their own way, toward a future that was slowly becoming clearer. Fall 1978, Tinsley Elementary, Richmond, Virginia. The air had a crispness that signaled the start of a new school year. Students shuffled into Tinsley Elementary with mixed emotions, some eager, others wary. Jerome, now in the 8th grade, felt a familiar blend of hope and apprehension as he stepped through the doors. He had grown taller over the summer, his voice deeper, and his presence more assured. His mother, Ruby, had noticed the changes too. He wasn't just a student anymore. He was becoming a young man with a clearer sense of purpose. The school, in some ways, felt different as well. Over the summer, several new black teachers had been hired, fulfilling one of the demands from the previous year's march. There were also new programs focused on black history and culture, though they were often framed as special topics, rather than integral parts of the curriculum. Mrs. Greer, still at Tinsley despite continuing offers to move elsewhere, felt a mix of hope and skepticism. She had seen too many cycles of reform that promised much and delivered little. Yet the presence of new black teachers, colleagues who shared her experiences and values, felt like a small but meaningful victory. Ruby's new role. Ruby had become a recognized figure in the community's educational advocacy movement. Her tireless efforts had not only secured tangible wins, but had also earned her a seat on the newly formed Parent-Teacher Advisory Council. This council, designed to bridge the gap between parents and educators, was meant to ensure that parents' voices were heard in decision-making. During one of the council meetings, the conversation shifted to standardized testing, a topic that had long troubled Ruby. She had seen how these tests often disadvantaged black students, setting them up for failure rather than success. Testing should reflect what our children know, not what they've been denied, Ruby argued passionately. We need assessments that recognize different learning styles and cultural backgrounds. Her words were met with nods from some members and skepticism from others. Mr. Howard, a veteran white teacher who had often clashed with Ruby's approach, spoke up. "I understand the concerns, Mrs. Thomas," he said slowly. "But these tests are the standard. Changing them would be a huge challenge." Ruby's eyes flashed with determination. "Then it's a challenge worth taking. If the standard is failing our children, it's the standard that needs to change." The meeting ended with a promise to revisit the issue, but Ruby knew that the path to meaningful reform would be long and arduous. Still, she felt a growing sense of power in her role, not just as a mother, but as a leader in the fight for educational justice. Jerome's encounter with authority. As Jerome navigated 8th grade, he found himself increasingly willing to speak up, not just in the classroom, but also in school-wide meetings and events. His newfound confidence, however, was not always welcomed. One afternoon, during a discussion about American history in social studies class, Jerome raised his hand. The lesson was about the civil rights movement, and Jerome was eager to add the stories he had learned from his grandfather and the summer program. Dr. King's speeches were important, he began, but there were also local activists here in Richmond who made a difference. We need to learn about them too. His teacher, Mr. Blanchard, a well-meaning but somewhat rigid educator, looked slightly annoyed. "Jerome, while that's true, our curriculum is already set. We need to stick to the material that's been outlined." Jerome felt a surge of frustration. He had heard similar responses before, polite dismissals that masked a deeper refusal to truly integrate Black perspectives into the curriculum. But how can we understand history if we only learn part of it? Jerome pressed, his voice steady but firm. The room fell silent, and Mr. Blanchard paused before responding. That's a fair point, Jerome, but it's not something we can change today. The exchange, though brief, stayed with Jerome. He had begun to understand that integration wasn't just about being in the same classrooms. It was about having an equal say in what was taught, how it was taught, and who got to decide. Helen Jacobs' struggles. Helen Jacobs, the young white teacher who had been at Tinsley since the early days of integration, was facing struggles of her own. The changes in the school's approach to race and history had inspired her, but they had also forced her to confront her own biases and assumptions. One day, during a staff meeting, she raised her hand. "I think we need more training on how to teach these new curriculums effectively," she said. "It's not just about adding new content. It's about changing how we think about history and culture." Some of her colleagues nodded in agreement, while others seemed indifferent. Mrs. Greer, who had been silently observing, felt a flicker of hope. Helen's willingness to embrace not just content changes but pedagogical shifts was a sign that deeper change was possible. After the meeting, Helen approached Mrs. Greer. "I know I still have a lot to learn," she admitted, "but I really want to get this right." Mrs. Greer smiled warmly. "It's a journey, Helen. The fact that you're willing to learn and unlearn is what matters." The unraveling. Despite the progress, not everything was improving at Tinsley. A series of incidents revealed that racism, both overt and subtle, still lingered within the walls of the school. One such incident occurred when a Black student named Tamika was sent to the principal's office for disruptive behavior. Her offense? Raising her hand repeatedly to correct a teacher's mispronunciation of her name. When Tamika's mother confronted the principal, she was met with defensiveness. "We're doing our best to create a fair environment," he insisted. "But sometimes students need to understand that disruptions aren't helpful." Tamika's mother left the meeting in tears, feeling the familiar sting of being unheard and unseen. News of the incident spread quickly, reigniting tensions among parents, students, and staff. Ruby, upon hearing about Tamika's experience, felt a renewed sense of urgency. "We can't just focus on big reforms," she told the Parent-Teacher Advisory Council. "We need to address the everyday racism that our children face. It's not just about the system, it's about the people in it." Her words prompted a new round of discussions, this time focused on implicit bias training for teachers and staff. The council agreed to implement a pilot program, though Ruby knew it would take more than workshops to change hearts and minds. Mrs. Greer's turning point. As the school year wore on, Mrs. Greer felt a growing sense of weariness. She had dedicated decades to teaching, fighting, and mentoring, but the constant push for equity was taking its toll. She wondered if it was time to retire, to let younger educators take up the mantle. One evening, after a particularly long day, Mrs. Greer sat in her classroom, alone and exhausted. Jerome knocked on the door and poked his head inside. "You okay, Mrs. Greer?" he asked quietly. She looked up, surprised to see him. "I'm fine, Jerome," she said with a tired smile. "Just thinking." "About what?" he pressed, his curiosity sincere. "About whether I'm still making a difference," she admitted. "Sometimes it feels like 2 steps forward and 1 step back." Jerome considered her words carefully before replying. "You are making a difference, Mrs. Greer, even if it's just one person at a time." His words, simple yet profound, brought tears to Mrs. Greer's eyes. She realized that the struggle, however slow and painful, was still worth fighting. A new hope. As winter approached, the school community prepared for another forum, this time focused on equity and accountability. Ruby, Helen, Jerome, and Mrs. Greer were all involved in the planning, determined to create a space where real conversations could take place. On the day of the forum, the turnout was larger than expected. Parents, teachers, students, and even members of the school board filled the auditorium. Jerome, despite his initial nerves, stepped up to the microphone to open the event. "This isn't just about what happens inside these walls," he began. "It's about what happens in our minds and in our hearts. If we want real change, we have to be willing to listen, to learn, and to act." The crowd applauded, and Jerome felt a surge of pride. He was no longer just a student navigating integration. He was a young leader, determined to help shape the future. As the forum continued, Ruby, Mrs. Greer, and Helen all spoke, each offering their perspectives and commitments to a more just and equitable school environment. It was a moment of solidarity, a reminder that while the road ahead was still long, the journey was being taken together. The chapter closes with a sense of cautious optimism. The characters have each faced personal and systemic challenges, but they have also found new strength in their shared struggle. The path toward meaningful integration remains difficult, but for the first time, it feels achievable, not through compliance, but through collective resistance and resilience. Winter 1979, Tinsley Elementary, Richmond, Virginia. The cold winds of winter swept through the streets of Richmond, biting at exposed skin and chilling the already tense atmosphere around Tinsley Elementary. Inside the school, the mood mirrored the weather, cold, stark, and unforgiving. The initial progress, following last year's reforms, was showing signs of strain, revealing the fragility of the changes that had been won. Jerome, now in 9th grade, felt the weight of the shifting dynamics. He was caught between the hope he'd felt during the recent forum and the growing sense of resistance from those unwilling to adapt. His teachers, including Mrs. Greer and Helen Jacobs, had been trying to implement the more inclusive curriculum they had fought for. But pushback was inevitable. One morning, during a history lesson on the Reconstruction era, Jerome noticed a group of white students whispering and snickering at the back of the class. When the teacher, Mr. Blanchard, asked for comments on the lesson, one of the boys raised his hand. "Why do we have to keep learning about slavery and civil rights?" the student asked, his voice laced with annoyance. "Can't we focus on the parts of history that make America look good for once?" Jerome felt anger rising in his chest, but he kept his composure. He raised his hand, his voice steady. "We learn this history because it's part of who we are. Ignoring it won't make it go away." The tension in the room was palpable. Mr. Blanchard cleared his throat awkwardly. "Both perspectives are important," he said hastily, trying to diffuse the situation. But Jerome felt that the comment had diminished the significance of the very history they were supposed to be confronting. Ruby's growing frustration. Meanwhile, Ruby found herself more frustrated than ever. The council meetings had become more contentious, as some parents, mostly white, argued that the focus on black history and equity was divisive. Ruby faced thinly veiled accusations that the reforms were going too far, suggesting that the emphasis on equity was creating an unfair advantage for black students. During one particularly heated meeting, a parent named Mrs. Wilson, who had recently joined the council, spoke up. "I'm all for equal opportunity," she said carefully, "but I think we need to make sure that our children aren't made to feel guilty about things they had nothing to do with." Ruby, feeling the familiar burn of restrained anger, stood up. "This isn't about making anyone feel guilty," she said firmly. "It's about telling the truth. And the truth is that our children deserve to see themselves in their education, not just as footnotes, but as central figures." The tension in the room was thick, but Ruby's words resonated with many of the black parents present. The meeting ended with no clear resolutions, but Ruby's stance had made one thing clear. The push for equity wasn't just about representation. It was about redefining what education meant for everyone. Mrs. Greer's quiet resolve. Despite the growing pressure, Mrs. Greer remained steady, continuing to advocate for her students in ways both big and small. She had witnessed backlash before, and she understood that true change was never linear. It was often 2 steps forward and 1 step back. One day during lunch, Helen approached Mrs. Greer, her face lined with worry. "Elaine, I feel like things are getting worse, not better," she admitted. "Some of the teachers are talking about how they don't agree with the new curriculum changes, and the students are picking up on it." Mrs. Greer nodded, her expression calm but resolute. "Change always brings resistance, Helen. But we can't let that stop us. It's hard now, but we're planting seeds. Some of them won't grow right away, but some will." Helen sighed, still unsure. "I just don't know if we're making enough of a difference." "You are," Mrs. Greer assured her. "You're making a difference every time you push back, every time you teach with compassion. Don't underestimate that." Jerome's turning point. As the winter wore on, Jerome found himself at a personal crossroads. The pressures of school, home, and activism were beginning to take a toll. One afternoon, as he walked home from school, he was stopped by a group of older boys, some of whom he recognized as former Tinsley students. "Hey, Jerome," one of them called out, grinning, "you still trying to be the next Martin Luther King?" The question was meant as a taunt, but Jerome stood his ground. "Why not?" he shot back. "At least I'm trying to make things better." The boy's grin faded, replaced by a sneer. "Better for who? You think all this marching and protesting actually changes anything? Look around, man, nothing's different." Jerome felt a mix of frustration and sadness. He knew the boy's words were partly true, progress was slow and setbacks were constant, but he also knew that the struggle was necessary, even if the victories were small and hard to measure. That evening, Jerome sat at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. Ruby noticed his fatigue and sat down beside him. "What's going on, baby?" she asked gently. "I just don't know if it's worth it sometimes," Jerome admitted, his voice low. "It feels like we keep fighting, but nothing really changes." Ruby reached out, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "I know it's hard," she said softly. "But remember, every time you stand up, you're making it a little easier for the next person to do the same." Her words lingered in Jerome's mind as he went to bed that night. He realized that the fight for justice wasn't about immediate results. It was about laying the groundwork for those who would come after him. The community pushes back. As tensions continued to build, Ruby and other community leaders decided to organize another march, this time focused specifically on protecting the gains they had made. The event was planned for early spring, with the goal of reminding the school board and the wider community that the push for equity wasn't over. On the day of the march, the crowd was larger than expected. Parents, teachers, students, and even some city officials gathered with signs reading, "Truth matters, equity is for everyone, and history for all students." Jerome stood near the front, holding a sign that read, "Our stories, our education." As the march wound its way through the streets of Richmond, Ruby felt a surge of pride. Despite the setbacks and resistance, the movement was still alive, still pushing forward. It was a reminder that while the struggle was hard, it was also worthwhile. When the march reached the school board offices, Ruby once again stepped up to speak. Her voice was stronger than before, filled with the determination of someone who had faced down countless obstacles. "We're here today because the fight for equity isn't just a goal, it's a necessity," she declared. "We will not go backward, we will not be silent, and we will not stop until our children have the education they deserve." The crowd erupted into cheers, and Jerome felt a swell of emotion. It wasn't just pride, it was a sense of belonging, of being part of something bigger than himself. Mrs. Greer's quiet victory. The following week, Mrs. Stark Greer received a surprise visit from the school principal, Mr. Rogers. He seemed both hesitant and sincere as he sat down across from her. "Mrs. Greer," he began, "I wanted to let you know that the school board has approved a new course on African American history. We'll be offering it next year as an elective." Mrs. Greer felt a rush of relief and satisfaction. It wasn't everything she had hoped for, but it was a step, a real, tangible step. "Thank you," she said simply. "It's about time." As Mr. Rogers left, Mrs. Greer allowed herself a rare moment of quiet triumph. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was proof that persistence could yield results. Jerome's renewal. With the new elective course on the horizon, Jerome felt a renewed sense of purpose. He signed up immediately, eager to learn more about his own history in a formal setting. When he shared the news with Ruby, she hugged him tightly. "I'm proud of you," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "This is just the beginning, Jerome. You're making a difference, one step at a time." As the chapter comes to a close, the characters stand at a moment of both progress and uncertainty. They have won small battles, but the larger war for equity is still far from over. Yet, in the midst of the challenges, there is a growing sense of hope. Hope that the seeds they have planted will continue to grow, nurtured by the resilience and determination of those who refuse to give up. Spring 1980, Tinsley Elementary, Richmond, Virginia. The new African American history elective was underway, and its impact was immediately felt. Students were excited, parents were cautiously optimistic, and teachers like Mrs. Greer saw the course as a sign of real progress. Jerome was one of the first to enroll, eager to deepen his understanding of his own history and the wider African American experience. The class, taught by Mr. Harris, was a stark contrast to Jerome's previous history lessons. Mr. Harris, a passionate teacher who had participated in the civil rights movement, approached the subject with both candor and compassion. He wasn't afraid to tackle tough topics, from slavery to Jim Crow to the ongoing struggle for voting rights. One day, during a discussion about black resistance during the civil rights movement, Jerome found himself deeply engaged. It wasn't just about big names like Dr. King or Malcolm X, Mr. Harris emphasized. It was about everyday people who stood up, spoke out, and made change happen. Jerome felt a surge of inspiration. He had heard similar words from his mother and Mrs. Greer, but hearing them in a classroom validated everything he'd been fighting for. It was proof that the story of Black America wasn't just a sidebar, it was central to the nation's history. The pushback. However, not everyone was pleased with the new elective. Some parents, primarily white, expressed concerns that the course was too divisive and focused too much on negative aspects of American history. Letters were sent to the school board, some demanding that the elective be removed or balanced with a similar course on patriotic American history. Ruby, upon hearing this news, felt a familiar anger rise within her. "It's always the same," she told Helen during a meeting. "The moment we start to make real progress, they try to take it back." Helen nodded, her face lined with concern. "We can't let them roll back what we fought for," she agreed. "If we do, it'll be that much harder to move forward again." The school board, facing mounting pressure, scheduled a public hearing to decide the fate of the elective. The hearing would determine not just the course's future, but the broader trajectory of educational equity at Tinsley. The auditorium was packed on the night of the hearing. Parents, teachers, students, and community members filled the seats, many holding signs supporting the course. Jerome sat with Ruby and Mrs. Greer, feeling both nervous and determined. The board members listened to testimonies from both sides. Some parents argued that the course was essential for understanding the full scope of American history, while others insisted it was biased and un-American. When it was Ruby's turn to speak, she stood up confidently. "This course isn't about dividing us," she declared. "It's about understanding our past, so we can build a better future. If we can't face our history honestly, how can we expect to make real progress?" Her words were met with applause, but the decision remained uncertain. The outcome? After hours of deliberation, the school board voted to keep the elective, but with a caveat: the curriculum would be reviewed to ensure balance. It wasn't the complete victory Ruby had hoped for, but it was enough to keep the course in place. Mrs. Greer felt a mix of relief and frustration. "It's always a compromise," she told Helen afterward, "but at least we're still moving forward." Jerome, despite the board's decision to review the course, felt a sense of pride. It was a step, one that he and his community had fought hard to protect. Summer 1981, Richmond, Virginia. The summer brought new challenges and new opportunities. Ruby, now deeply embedded in local activism, was approached by a group of community leaders encouraging her to run for a seat on the Richmond School Board. The idea intrigued her, but it also scared her. "I'm not a politician," she told Mrs. Greer one afternoon. "I'm just a mother trying to make things better." "But that's exactly why you'd be good for it," Mrs. Greer replied. "You understand the struggle firsthand, and you're not afraid to speak the truth." Ruby's decision wasn't easy, but after weeks of reflection and conversations with Jerome, she agreed to run. Her campaign, driven by grassroots support, focused on educational equity, increased funding for Black schools, and a more inclusive curriculum. Jerome's growth. Meanwhile, Jerome was preparing for high school. His experiences at Tinsley had shaped him profoundly, giving him both a sense of purpose and a clearer understanding of the challenges ahead. As he transitioned to a new school, he carried with him the lessons of resilience, activism, and the importance of knowing one's history. At the new school, Jerome faced familiar challenges but also found new allies, students who shared his commitment to equity. He joined the student council determined to continue pushing for meaningful change. Helen's departure. Helen Jacobs, after years of teaching at Tinsley, decided to take a break. She felt burnt out, having devoted so much of her energy to fighting for reforms. In her resignation letter, she wrote, "I leave not because I've given up, but because I need to replenish my spirit. I hope to return one day with renewed strength to continue the fight for equity." Her departure was a blow to the community, but Mrs. Greer understood. Sometimes we need to step back so we can keep moving forward. She told Helen during a tearful farewell. Spring 1982, Richmond, Virginia. Ruby won her election to the Richmond School Board, marking a significant victory for the community. Her presence on the board was a constant reminder of the grassroots fight for equity, and she brought a new perspective to policy discussions. Jerome, now a sophomore in high school, found himself stepping into a leadership role among his peers. He continued to advocate for educational reform, leading campaigns for better textbooks, more diverse teachers, and expanded cultural programs. Mrs. Greer, still at Tinsley, remained a pillar of strength. She had seen many changes over the years, but she was most proud of the students like Jerome, who had emerged as leaders. The future of Tinsley. Tinsley Elementary had changed significantly since the early days of integration. The school was still not perfect, but it had become a model of what was possible when communities refused to give up. The curriculum was more inclusive, the teachers were more diverse, and the students, Black, white, and otherwise, were beginning to see themselves as equal partners in their education. A final reflection. As the chapter closes, Ruby, Jerome, and Mrs. Greer reflect on how far they've come and how much work remains. They know that the fight for equity is far from over, but they also know that they have made a lasting impact. Ruby stands outside Tinsley one afternoon, watching children of all races playing together on the playground. "This is just the beginning," she says quietly to Mrs. Greer, who nods in agreement. "Yes," Mrs. Greer replies, "but it's a good beginning." Epilogue. Seeds of Tomorrow, Fall 1985, Richmond, Virginia. The years pass, bringing new challenges and victories. Jerome graduates high school, having become a respected student leader. Ruby remains on the school board, pushing for systemic reforms and ensuring that the voices of marginalized communities are heard. Mrs. Greer finally retires, leaving behind a legacy of resilience, compassion, and unyielding dedication to her students. The epilogue ends with a new generation of students entering Tinsley Elementary, students who benefit from the battles fought before them. The school, now more diverse and inclusive, stands as a symbol of what is possible when communities refuse to give up. Ruby, Jerome, and Mrs. Greer gather at a community event commemorating Tinsley's transformation. As they watch the new students, Jerome turns to his mother. "We did it," he says softly. Ruby smiles. "We did our part," she replies. "Now it's up to them." The story ends with a sense of both closure and hope. The fight for equity continues, but the seeds planted by Ruby, Jerome, and Mrs. Greer have taken root, offering the promise of a better future. Thank you for watching. A truly beautiful piece about the Flowers family torn apart. Life becomes so much brighter and more meaningful. If this story resonates with you, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy inspiring and insightful stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to TMY Stories to continue this journey with me in future videos. And remember to turn on notifications so you don't miss any future content. Thank you again for your support, and see you in the next meaningful story.